All right, friends. So now that we understand what a function is and how to utilize function notation to evaluate and solve various expressions, we are diving into our first big pre-calculus concept, which is beginning to analyze graphs. You did not need to complete the exploration, but I am going to discuss it quickly. So on this exploration, we were given a list of orders from a fast food chain, and we were asked to list those items out. We were then told that we could give the order anywhere from 1 to 5 stars with no partial or decimal stars allowed, and asked to list that out. When listing out a set of numbers, we use squiggly brackets, but you're not often going to see this in AP Pre-Calculus. The reason being is because of this example right here. We're told that the app guarantees your order in less than 20 minutes, and then we're told to list all possible delivery times or explain why it's not possible. Well, unfortunately, unlike example 2, it's not possible to list every single time in between 0 and 20 minutes because there's an infinite number of times. With that in mind, that brings us to our topic today, or at least our first topic, which is interval and inequality notation. So for inequality notation, this is how we represent an interval with which a number lies in. So for example, when we think about ordering, we know that the order is going to take anywhere from 0 to 20 minutes. It can't take exactly 0 minutes, that would be impossible, and the app guarantees less than 20. So if I were to write that out using inequality notation, I would say that a value must be greater than 0 and less than 20. However, if the app changed and said that it could take exactly or less than 20 minutes, meaning it is now possible for it to take 20 minutes, I could just add an equal sign to this expression, indicating that this mystery value still must be greater than 0, but could be less than or also equal to 20. These inequality expressions are easier to read, and I would assume that you've encountered inequalities in your other math classes. However, in AP Pre-Calculus, we step it up, and the inequality notation is less common. The notation you're going to see more commonly is going to be interval notation. For interval notation, we still use both numbers, but we just separate them with a comma as opposed to using those inequality signs. And then on either side of A and B, we're going to add a sign that indicates if the value is less than, greater than, or equal to. So for this top example right here, where A and B are excluded, meaning this value cannot be A and cannot be B, but must be something in between those numbers, we would write it out using parentheses. However, if we decide to change it up, and now we're saying, hey, it can be equal to A, it can be equal to A, or it could be something between those values, we use brackets. A big thing to note is that they are equivalent. So using a inequality symbol and using a parentheses are the same thing. Using a inequality with an equal sign is the same as using a bracket. A last little note is infinities. So if there is no upper or lower bound, we use infinity. It's important to note that you can never equal infinity. If you were to sit there right now and try to count to infinity, it would be a pretty impossible task and you'd be counting for quite some time. So if one of our bounds is an infinity, make sure that you are using an inequality or just regular parentheses. Make sure you are never including the equal sign or using a bracket. So let's jump into some practice. So in this first example, I'm noticing that I have closed circles. When you have closed circles, that is the number line's way of saying the value can be equal to -2, and it can be equal to +2, or it could be any number in between those guys. So if I were to write this out using inequality notation, I would say that -2 is less than or equal to x, which must be less than or equal to +2. If I were to turn this into interval notation, I would use a bracket on both sides because both sides have an equal sign, and then separate those two numbers with a comma. On this example, you'll notice that the circle is now open. This means that the value can be anything in between -7 and -3, but it can never actually be -7 or -3. My answer could be something really, really close, like -6.99999 repeating, but it'll never actually be -7. In terms of inequality notation, I would represent this by saying -7 must be less than x, which must be less than -3. For interval notation, I would again separate my two numbers using a comma, and then I would put just a curved parentheses on either side. For my third example, you notice that we now have a gap, indicating that we are doing more than one interval, and you'll also notice that we have these arrows. On the left-hand side, this arrow indicates that we are going all the way to -infinity. There is no lower bound. So for my inequality notation, I would say that -infinity is less than x, which is less than or equal to 12. Again, I'm including this equal sign because this dot above 12 is filled in. To represent my other interval, I then use a comma, or sometimes you'll see the word or written in between them. And I write out another inequality statement. Similar to the previous one, I have an arrow which indicates that I'm going up forever, or in other words, positive infinity. So I would say that 15 is less than x, which is less than infinity. Again, I'm not including an equal sign because my circle is open. In order to write this out using interval notation, I would put -infinity, comma 12. I can never equal an infinity no matter what, so I would use a curved parentheses. Because there is an equal sign on this inequality, though, I'm going to use a bracket for the 12. When using interval notation, we do not separate with a comma, but instead we use a large U, known as the union symbol. And then I can write out my interval for the right-hand side using a parentheses on both sides in this case. Last example, you'll notice it's similar to the previous one, except now we have a singular dot. When using inequality notation, we represent an individual dot by simply saying x equals that value. And then we could say, or we could also use the comma like in the previous example, 5 must be less than x, which is less than positive infinity. In terms of interval notation, that singular value is just represented with some brackets. I once again use the large U or the union symbol, and then I would use a parentheses on both sides over here. At this point, you are going to navigate to your Delta Math, and you are going to complete the section 1.2 practice. Please spend no more than 20 minutes on this practice. You do not need to get this assignment done. It is not additional homework. I simply would like you just to spend about 20 minutes practicing interval and inequality notation before watching the next video and then beginning to work on your homework assignments for this week.